Amanda and I had a lot of fun actually working on this project, and we appreciate the opportunity to share our work with everyone who was on the webinar today. Today's webinar has 4 parts. First, I'll talk about the objective and scope of the project. Then Amanda will cover understanding rules compliance. She'll talk about the reasons for rule noncompliance and how it might occur. Then we'll switch back to me and I'll describe the categories of best practices and give you some examples. And then finally, Amanda will discuss safety reporting systems and the prototype safety reporting system that we designed as part of this project for the transit industry. I think many of you are aware that there is a voluntary APTA standard for rules compliance testing in rail. While this is an important step, more remains to be done. Recent incidents that resulted from rules violations led TRB to select this topic for a project. Specifically, I'm referring to the September 2008 Chatsworth incident and the MBTA Green Line incident that both resulted from an operator engaging in texting while operating a vehicle, clearly a rule violation. The objective of this project was to develop a resource for improving safety-related rule compliance in the transit industry. And specifically, the resource that they were looking for was the report that we developed. The focus of the project and of the document is primarily on rules designed to prevent high consequence events, things like the Chatsworth incident and actually 2 crashes that the MBTA has had. The intent was that the resource document would apply to all employees who are involved in the operation and maintenance of a transit system. In conducting the project, we included all modes of transit and all sizes of transit system. With few exceptions, the best practices that we'll describe in a little while apply across the spectrum of transit operations, large and small, bus, rail, heavy rail, light rail, whatever. We put considerable effort into collecting information about existing rules compliance practices from transit agencies as well as other modes of transportation. And in fact, I think there are probably people participating in this webinar whose agencies we talked with in the process of doing the project. We also sought input from representatives of labor organizations that represent transit operators. In terms of scope, while there's a close relationship between safety culture and rules compliance, this project did not deal with safety culture because TRP has a separate project on that topic. However, there is some mention of it in the report because it's hard to talk about rules compliance without looking at it within the context of the organization's safety culture. This is the layout of the document, and probably many of you have already looked at the report or read part of it. It has a brief introduction that has some of the things that I just mentioned. In addition, the introduction provides some guidance on how to use the document, makes some suggestions about the steps to take if you are instituting a new rules compliance program. And that's basically what's in the introduction. Then the Understanding Rules Compliance section provides some background research that has been done that relates to the whole issue of rules compliance. The Classifying Noncompliance chapter is a methodology to follow to identify the root cause of rules noncompliance. We could probably do a whole webinar just on that topic alone, so we'll be giving just a brief overview of that. Chapter 4 is best practices that you can use, which I'll be talking about. And finally, we have the safety reporting system that we designed based on looking at safety reporting systems and other modes of transportation. And we discovered that there were 2 ongoing ones in transit, which we'll talk about briefly. And then, of course, it has the references primarily referring to things that are in Chapter 2, And we have a series of appendices that provide a whole range of material that we collected in the process of doing this.
When Judy and I first started this project, we began with a comprehensive literature review to help us better understand the issues surrounding rules compliance. And based on the literature review, we came up with a framework that virtually shaped the rest of the project. And the framework was centered around the premise that rules noncompliance has two basic root causes. That is, it can be intentional, it can result from the intentional acts of an individual to disobey the rules, or it can happen for unintentional reasons, which you'll see later I call honest mistakes, and talk about the framework surrounding those. First, I'm going to talk about intentional noncompliance, which we think of as traditional violations. And violations are ultimately influenced by the environment in which they occur. Many times we think about just the egregious acts that someone might commit, but there are very distinct underlying reasons why somebody might disobey a rule. And so one of the first types of violations that I'd like to talk about are situational violations. And a classic example of a situational violation is when an operator feels the pressure to be on time and adhere to those performance goals and chooses to ignore a particular safety rule. And this arises oftentimes as a result of either inconsistent supervision or discipline, but also from inconsistent safety messages throughout the organization. For example, upper management might say that safety is paramount to the operations of the agency, but then for whatever reason that message doesn't trickle down to the supervisory level where they might be more concerned with on-time performance. A second type of violation that we found in the literature were exceptional violations. Exceptional violations occur in unusual circumstances where the rule just doesn't adequately address the situation at hand. And for the most part, we can think of exceptional violations as occurring during emergency situations. These types of violations often result from inadequate training for emergencies or even vague rules for these certain types of circumstances. An example of this was when a man had a heart attack on a subway, and the operator chose to go to the final stop rather than to stop immediately and obtain medical assistance. Which could have been a life-saving act. And so that type of situation points to training or situations that don't happen very often. The next type of violation are referred to as routine violations. You can think of these as habitual violations. And in everyday life, you can think of this as the habitual tendency to speed or go above the speed limit. And more often than not, you tend to continue to have these types of violations because you don't get caught. So therefore, the lack of supervision or the lack of enforcement is a real determinant for whether or not something becomes a routine violation. And then finally, as I mentioned before, violations are often thought of as just these egregious or criminal acts or somebody just like blatantly disobeying the rule. But these are actually very rare instances when these happen. And they generally occur due to maladaptive personalities or some underlying psychopathology in many instances. What I just talked about now refers to the intentional aspects of noncompliance. But as we delved into the literature, we realized that in many instances, noncompliance is an honest mistake brought about by unintentional actions. And even though this particular diagram on this slide looks like a very complicated set of circumstances here, it's really made up of four basic types of errors that are associated with unintentional noncompliance. And they can be broken down into these four categories of perceptual errors, skill-based errors, strategy-based errors, and for the purposes of the report, we call these strategy-based errors, but if you look into the literature yourself, you will find that they're also known as rule-based errors. And then the last one of those is knowledge-based errors, and I'm going to go through each of those individually. Perceptual errors happen when information is visually or auditorily not correctly interpreted. And an example of this is just something simple like signage being degraded or obscured, or perhaps noisy radio communications preventing the individual from correctly interpreting what's being communicated about. Skill-based errors happen to highly skilled individuals. And so when we think of skill-based behavior, it's that highly automatic type of behavior. And driving is a prime example of skill-based behavior. So that the errors associated with this type of behavior occur when a driver sort of zones out. They're so used to operating that they easily become either inattentive or distractive. And compounding skill-based errors are factors like fatigue, which make you much more likely to have an error when you're in that sort of zoned out state. Third category is the strategy-based errors. These happen for working situations where the operator has specific rules or strategies that they use in their everyday jobs, but they may apply the wrong strategy to the situation at hand. And then the last type of error are knowledge-based errors. This type of error is completely contrasts against the skill-based errors in that knowledge-based errors are more likely to happen to the novice operator. When these types of errors happen, the operator simply just does not have enough information to process what's going on. And so that's why I say novice operators are particularly prone to knowledge-based errors. Training is paramount for mitigating these types of errors. Using this framework, and also by relying on certain human error models and classification systems, such as Reason's Swiss cheese model that you see in this particular slide, and also HFACS, which is also known as the Human Factors Analysis and Classification System, Judy and I developed a non-compliance classification system for the transit industry. And as Judy had mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we also developed an associated root cause analysis methodology, and these are described in Chapter 3. And the idea behind a root cause analysis is that if you can identify the particular reasons that noncompliance occurs, then you can adopt the appropriate mitigating response for that and prevent it from happening in the future.
The next section here has to do with the best practices that we found for transit, for rules compliance. And the way we identified these practices was that we interviewed a whole range of transit agencies of different sizes, different modes. We talked to representatives from the aviation industry, the railroad industry, chemical processing, and try to identify what were things that had worked successfully for them. And all of this is documented in one of the appendices. I forgot which one. One thing that I would like to emphasize before I start this is that keep in mind that a rules compliance program is not the same thing as rules testing or operational testing. A lot of people, when you say rules compliance, they say, oh, we have a testing program. Well, it's really a lot more than that. And we found after all the talking that we did that there were really 6 categories of practices that constitute a rules compliance program. Rules compliance really begins when you screen and select employees. You want to select people who are not risk takers. And we discovered that actually there had been some research done in aviation that found that pilots who had alcohol-related highway convictions were in fact risk takers and didn't make such good pilots. The second category is training and testing. Once you have a new employee on board, you want to make sure that you train them to achieve a certain skill level that the training is designed for. So we have some suggestions in the report on effective training techniques, as well as testing to make sure that the training objective is achieved once the training program is completed. Once folks are out there working, you want to have a communication program that reinforces existing rules, and communicates new rules as they are put into place. And then probably what people think of as a rules compliance program, you want to monitor for rules compliance. And I'll spend some time talking about some techniques that are used here. And this is where the operational or rules testing comes in. You undoubtedly, at some point, will have some kind of noncompliance, and you need to respond to it. And the key here is what Amanda just talked about, is that you have to understand what the reason for the noncompliance was to take the appropriate action so that it doesn't happen again. Then the last category is safety management. And this is where a safety reporting system comes in, as well as other things. Now, Table 10 in the report, which is on page 40, has a complete list of the practices in each of these 6 categories. And obviously, we don't have time today to go through all of them. So I'm just going to give you some highlights. Now, in the beginning of the report, in the introduction, there's a rules compliance checklist. Now, we created this checklist to help an agency identify areas where there is need for additional measures to support rules compliance. And I just have a sample of the questions here. But for example, related to screening and selecting employees, one of the questions is, do you screen for risk-taking behavior when you evaluate candidates? If you say no, then you're referred to the practice that relates to that. Similarly, with training and testing, 2 of the questions are, does your rules training demonstrate the application of the rule? Do you give feedback to the training during and after practice? Well, both of these relate to what we called action-based rules training. In terms of communication, do you have communication strategies that reinforce the importance of adhering to rules? For monitoring rules compliance, do you have an operational testing program? Responding to noncompliance, do you identify the underlying causes of noncompliant events? And then in terms of safety management, does your process for evaluating your rules compliance program incorporate both leading and lagging indicators, which I'll talk about in a minute? Do you have a confidential, non-punitive, and voluntary means for employees to report near misses or unsafe conditions? And this is the safety reporting system that Amanda will talk about in a little while. Continuous improvement in a rules compliance program requires ways to monitor and measure the practices to encourage safe behavior, because you can't improve what you don't measure. And this is what a lot of safety professionals will tell you. It's important to include a mix of leading and lagging indicators. Now, when you hear the term leading and lagging indicators, most people think in terms of economics and finance, but it really has a very specific meaning here as well. Leading indicators focus on activities, processes, or conditions that will prevent or reduce the risk of having some lagging indicator occur. A lagging indicator is a measure of an undesirable outcome, such as a crash or someone being injured. Another difference between the 2 of these is that the leading indicators focus on process and they're achievement-oriented, things like training, putting out some kind of communication to reinforce a rule. Those are leading. Again, the lagging indicators are things that are sort of avoidance-oriented. They're things that you don't want to have happen. It's important to include both of these among your metrics for evaluating your program. But the tendency always is to focus on the lagging indicators, the accidents, the crashes. And by doing that, you're not really seeing the whole picture, because you could have a lot of risky situations existing that you really want to get under control so that they don't end up becoming a lagging indicator. Okay, I'm going to give you some best practice examples for 3 of the 6 areas that I talked about. And then in addition to the best practices, I'll give you our suggested effectiveness metrics There's a complete list of all of the effectiveness metrics in Appendix E in the report. And there are also many success stories and real life examples in the report, and I'll include a few of those as I talk about these things. Okay, so the first area is communication, and this involves ways to inform employees of new rules and encourage compliance with existing rules. Under communication, we have these 5 categories. I'll give you some best practice examples for the proactive rules communication and positive safety language, but I just want to say a little bit about the other 3 that are here. Opportunities to ask questions is things like providing a way for new trainees, once they've completed their training, to get answers to questions that they have about rules as they begin their job. It might be giving them the phone number of the trainee. It might be an open door policy with the manager of the division where an employee can come in and ask a question. In terms of communicating changes to rules, one of the interesting techniques that we heard from Metro-North Railroad was when they have a change in a very important rule, and I think they did this when they put their cell phone rule into effect. They did what they call a meet and greet, and the supervisor personally talked with each employee, gave them a copy of the rule, explained it, and gave the employee a chance to ask questions. And they say that that is a very effective technique. Another area for communication is with your customers. With the advent of all the electronic technology that we have today, it's become much easier for patrons to give feedback. And I know we're in the Boston area, and at the MBTA, when they put in their cell phone rule, it's a ban actually, the employees aren't even allowed to carry a cell phone with them. They had reports from patrons that a bus driver was using a cell phone. He obviously didn't understand something. So that's another mechanism for communication. And it also works in a positive way. One of the small transit agencies that I talked with, it was a community transit agency, said that everybody in the town knows who the drivers are. So it's very easy to go into the local restaurant and hear from someone that their driver did a good job, which is a lot of what they hear about. And it's also possible that they'll hear something that's not so positive. Let me move on here and talk a little bit about proactive rules communication. Proactive rules communication reinforces the reason for a rule and the consequences of noncompliance. And by consequences, I don't necessarily mean discipline. It can mean explaining what the consequences could be to the employee, to the patrons, or whatever. Now, ways to do proactive communication include things like posters, safety or training bulletins, and some agencies have a rule of the day or a rule of the week. And we have a really good example of a poster here. This came to us from LA, and this was the poster that they designed to get across the point about their cell phone rule. Now, some of the metrics that you could use for evaluating your communication are looking at the percent of your crew reporting locations where there are bulletin boards or variable message signs to communicate information, or looking at the percent of rule changes that get somehow posted in this way. Now, I also have an example here of a safety bulletin. This one was from Orange County. They had 2 incidents where a bus had started to go over a railroad crossing, and then the driver changed his or her mind and backed up, and the bus was hit by the crossing arm coming down. They put out this bulletin, and they posted it on all their bulletin boards. And they gave us several examples of incidents that they had publicized in this way, and this is a style that they use. All right, let me move on to positive safety language. Now, what do we mean by positive safety language? It's best explained with some examples here. Saying unanticipated or an unusual occurrence versus an incident. An incident has negative connotation, while saying unanticipated, unplanned is a more neutral term. In terms of looking at the results of a testing program, you might want to report the percent of people who are passing versus the percent failing. And reporting the results of testing as a percent passing conveys that the expectation is that everyone should be passing rather than focusing on those who don't pass. Now, here's an example of an unusual occurrence report. Rather than calling it an incident report, BART calls it an unusual occurrence report. In terms of how you might measure the use of positive safety language, you can look at the number or the percent of safety communications that contain this type of language. Now, this next category is one which many people think of when the term rules compliance is mentioned. But I think I've already said that it's not the whole program. Now, there are three categories of practices here: the operational testing, observational methods, and some automated methods. And actually, the automated and observational methods could be used as part of a formal testing program. I'm going to talk about the operational testing and the observational methods. The automated methods tend to be used in rail systems, and they involve specialized hardware like onboard event recorders on a locomotive or a lead car, or data from a signal system. Okay, what are the elements of a testing program? It needs to specify what organization is responsible for it. Perhaps it's the safety office, or maybe it's even a training office. What employees are covered by the program? What rules are covered and what testing methods are used to evaluate for each rule? What's the frequency of the testing? How many different tests are going to be done? How are employees notified of the results of the testing, and what kind of records are kept? And then finally, what kind of corrective action is taken? And usually the corrective action depends upon the nature of the noncompliance. This is not an eye test. This form is actually on page 52 in the report, and it's part of the MBTA's Safety Rules Compliance Program, which actually has all of these elements in it. Now, the MBTA set up their Safety Rules Compliance Program after a collision back in May 2008, and I believe the NTSB recommended that they put in practice a very formal structured program. To their credit, this accident occurred in May 2008, and in February 2009, this program was instituted. A steering committee oversees the program. They perform about 1,000 tests a month. Since the start of the program, they told me, there has been a decline in the number of safety rule violations, or to put it in more positive terms, there have been more instances of rule adherence. So when you have an operational testing program, you probably want to look at the number and types of tests that are being done, the percent that are passing, and how many major rule violations are there. The transit agencies that we talked with told us about a number of different observational techniques that they use, and some of these are part of a formal rules testing program, and some of them are not. Some of them use a ride-along. They have a supervisor, say, sit in the bus and observe the driver and coach the driver if there were better ways to do things or to handle the bus. Some places use a mystery rider. They don't tell the driver that there's an observer on board. Some places use an observer exterior to the vehicle. They might be in an overpass. They might be in an intersection watching how buses make turns and let people get on and off the bus. Some places will use do speed monitoring with a radar gun. Actually, I think the MBTA does this as part of their testing program. And finally, there are the video data recording systems, which is the newest addition to the technology here. This photograph is was given to us by the DriveCam people, and I think probably some of the people on the call have DriveCam in their bus systems. Basically, the way these systems work is there's a camera, and here it's mounted behind the rear view mirror, and there's a forward-facing camera and a rear-facing, and facing the driver and facing outside the window. And then there's a data logger that is under the hood, so to speak. And basically what happens is if there's any kind of sudden motion, like hard braking, sharp turns, the data logger will engage to record it, and it will save the video image of both the driver and the road ahead. A number of places that I spoke to that have this system, they told me that labor opposed it when it was first put in because they thought it was snooping on the driver. But after there was one incident, a crash, and the driver was exonerated from blame because there was a recording that shows clearly it was the other vehicle's fault, suddenly labor people saw that there was some value to it. So these things can be used in a positive way. They can be used for training, and they also can help you identify problems and rule noncompliance that you have. The other area where the video data recording systems have been used is in Metrolink. Metrolink has a locomotive digital video recorder system. And at the time that we did this project and when I spoke to the people out at Metrolink, there were some legal issues about it, and the system was going into their locomotives and it was being used for some very specific purposes. The project ended and I really haven't followed up on that, but they are being used in rail systems as well. From these observational methods, again, you could look at the number and types of observations, the percent or the number in compliance. Now, another type of observational method is the safety audit. This is an audit. It's not a testing program. Basically, a team goes out and observes employees in the workplace to identify safe and unsafe behaviors, and then they acknowledge the safe behavior while also correcting any deficiencies that they find. And it's usually used, for example, with track crews. It's a non-punitive process. New York City Transit has been doing this since mid-2007. They put their safety audit process into operation. Unfortunately, again, it was one of those situations where if there were two bad outcomes, there were two track workers killed in New York. The union worked with the agency to set up this audit program, and when they go out, I think 3 nights a week they go out, and it's a team consisting of someone from the union, someone from the safety office, I can't remember who the third person is, but they go out and they observe the track crews at work, and it's been working there. So again, in terms of the metrics you might want to use, how many safety audits you're able to do, what are the number of types of problems observed and coached. In terms of safety management, this encompasses a range of things. One is assessing the rules compliance. The goal of this type of a rules compliance program is to reduce the likelihood of a low probability, high consequence event. So as I said already, it's important to use both the leading and lagging indicators. There's no magic formula. Every agency has to determine what's the best set of metrics to use for their situation. But one thing you want to avoid is having too many measures because the burden of the record keeping could lead to abandoning the system or at least abandoning the leading indicators. If only lagging indicators, which again reflect a low probability, high consequence event, are used, you may have a false sense that everything is okay when in fact there are risks present, such as near misses, that are going unidentified. Now, having a labor management safety committee is one way to encourage employee involvement in your rules compliance program, and a way to also get a commitment to the program. In terms of near misses and other safety risks, there are 2 ways to provide for employees to report these near misses and safety risks: a safety reporting system and a safety hotline. Now, a safety hotline is a way for employees to report a concern. Usually it's a phone number that you can leave a message. But what I heard from number of people in the transit industry is many people don't want to use it because they see it as snitching on a fellow worker if there's some kind of risky behavior going on. But a safety reporting system can address this problem. But the safety hotline is also a way for employees to report rules that they perceive as confusing. So now the final part of this is in how do you incentivize rules compliance? The research literature is mixed on whether or not incentive systems should be used. Some argue that you shouldn't reward people for doing their job. Others say that it's a way to incentivize people to follow the rules. Some agencies that we talk to use a point system where employees can earn points for safety behaviors such as taking a training class, coaching another employee, or making a presentation at a safety meeting. Labor representatives that I spoke with told me that their people take pride in their work and they appreciate being recognized for having a good safety record. The recognition could be as simple as a letter of commendation from the agency's general manager or the division superintendent. I spoke with someone at New York City Transit from the subway division, and he told me that for many years they gave people lapel pins for successfully passing a rules check. And people appreciated that. These were things, I don't know how much they could have cost, 50 cents maybe. But in a budget cutting effort, the agency eliminated them. And this individual felt that was a mistake because it was short money and it went a long way with the employees.
Part of the scope of this project was to lay the foundation for a safety reporting system for the public transportation industry. And the reason for that is that traditionally, and particularly within the aviation environment, safety reporting systems have been invaluable tools for identifying the reasons for noncompliance. A prime example of that is the Aviation Safety Reporting System, which is a national reporting system administered by NASA. This system allows limited immunity, or the preferred term is reporting incentives, for pilots who report incidents and the causal factors surrounding those incidents. At the time of the report, air traffic controllers did not receive the same types of reporting incentives, but I'm going to talk about a program in just a minute called ADSAP where they do have those incentives. The second type of program, which is not nationally based, but is rather an organization-based program. Next slide, please. Are two programs. The first one originated, the Aviation Safety Action Program. It originated, I believe, in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was basically centered around the airlines themselves. And rather than have a nationally based system like ASRS, they wanted something where the information could get back to them more readily. And so the process by which this happens is that an incident is reported by an employee, and then it's viewed by an event review committee. And the reporter receives no discipline, and then the event review committee recommends corrective actions based on that. Now, there is the caveat with both of these systems that the reporting incentives or the limited immunity does not apply to egregious acts. So ADSAP came after ASAP, and that's the Air Traffic Safety Action Program. And it evolved because ASAP was so very successful, and ADSAP targets air traffic controller facilities. And so far, the pilot has been enormously successful. A third type of reporting system, or a third reporting system that we reviewed was the close calls reporting system that is piloted through the Federal Railroad Administration. And this type of safety reporting system is like a hybrid of ASRS and the ASAP-ADSAP programs. And I say that because currently with the pilot programs, the data is collected in a centralized system like ASRS does, but corrective actions make their way back to the participating railroads. So they do have that immediate feedback after something's reported regarding corrective actions. And the three key features of these programs include that they are voluntary, and that is, an individual is not compelled to submit a report, but they are incentivized to file a report. The second key feature is that it's a confidential system, and that's not equated with being an anonymous system. And the reason I say it's not anonymous is because follow-up with the reporter is really imperative so that you can get additional information if something's not clear about the report so that you can make the appropriate corrective actions. The third key feature of these reporting systems that we reviewed that are successful is that they're non-punitive. And the premise behind that is that there's a lot more to benefit to learning why something happened as compared with hoping that it doesn't happen again. Because you've simply disciplined something, and that tends to really shut people down. They're not going to share information with you if discipline is involved, particularly if they perceive the discipline to be unfair. Judy and I, after we had reviewed these types of systems, felt that organization-based systems are most likely to benefit the transit industry at the given time. There were two transit safety reporting systems that we reviewed, and Judy was primarily the point of contact with those reporting systems, so I'm going to let her speak to those right now.
We discovered two transit safety reporting systems, and I can't say for sure that these are the only two out there, but there were the two that we heard about through our contacts. One of them was New York City Transit, that's the subway system, their near-miss reporting system. They had always had, I think, going back to around 2003, they might have started it. After that the two terrible incidents in 2007, they began investigating near misses as well as real bad outcomes. One thing about their system, they do identify problems and deal with them, but it's not a confidential system, so that may discourage some people. The Sacramento system, I think, went in about 2 years ago, and that resulted from an incident where a track worker was killed by a light rail vehicle. And it turned out there that the employees actually sort of knew there were some risky situations going on because they didn't have the proper rules for roadway workers, but the employees didn't want to snitch out on each other. And the system that they put in place is not confidential, but it appears to be working. They've made some changes. I mean, and the manager there told me that the reason he thinks it's been so successful is because the management was willing to abandon the blame culture. There are some examples in transit. There may be others now since we finished this project.
And so one other thing that I wanted to mention before we go to the next slide too was regarding why we had suggested that public transportation industry would probably benefit more from an organization-based type of safety reporting system as opposed to a centralized one, is because the corrective actions for each individual agency are very specific to that particular agency. And as Judy and I were doing these interviews, we realized that there is a lot of variability between operations and operators even. And so the organization-based, the corrective feedback is probably best suited for an organization-based type of system. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the key features. And the first one is the aspect of having a non-punitive system. And really, no one is going to sort of fess up, so to speak, if they think they might lose their job or suffer from severe discipline. And so this culture of blame will really deter widespread safety reporting. You're not likely to get a whole lot of reports if you don't have a non-punitive system. One of the terminologies that we heard in the aviation environment was reporting incentives versus immunity. And the reason that I think the aviation environment preferred reporting incentives is that they don't want this to be viewed as a get-out-of-jail-free card. That's not what this is. So then the next confidential aspect, this is really that employees are able to report without their immediate working team knowing about the incident. And as I had mentioned before, this is not the same thing as being anonymous, because you will inevitably, at least the event reporting team will want to get back in touch with these individuals to clarify something about the report. The purpose of the confidentiality is just to make sure that the individual is not viewed differently by the team of individuals that they may be working with. It provides a means for employees to report so that they're unaware. Regarding educating management about confidentiality, this is really important, and there's factors that you need to take into account, because sometimes management is not inclined to have a confidential system. And one of those points of education is that it's more important to identify the root causes of errors and violation than it is to just simply assign blame to an individual. You can really prevent accidents by determining the root cause, and that in turn allows you to identify the proper mitigation strategies. Another feature is a voluntary system. The reason voluntary systems are so important, that over time they really build trust. And we saw that time and time again, not even just in the transportation safety reporting systems that we reviewed, but there were others that we had reviewed, like railroad, and then even some medical safety reporting systems. The other thing with the voluntary aspect is that in mandatory systems, and we found this from the literature, is that supervisors are often the reporters with mandatory systems. And really, if you're going to determine the reasons for why something happened, it has to be from the perspective of the person who experienced the event. This is really imperative, timely follow-up. You can't just have a system where you end up submitting reports and then that employee never gets any follow-up about it, or that there are no recommendations that come out of that, because then you do lose trust in the system that it's there, for a good reason. And at the end of the day, people really want to know that their voice is being heard. And third, follow-up encourages other employees to report based on word of mouth. One person tells another, hey, I submitted a report and something good came out of it, and I didn't get in trouble, and it just propagates from there. So through our review, we also came up with a list of ideal steps for implementing a reporting system. And these include, first of all, obtaining stakeholder buy-in. And so for the safety reporting systems that we had reviewed, the main stakeholders are the agencies themselves, labor, obviously, as well as a regulator. And so obtaining or getting to the point where you have buy-in and trust from all of those elements is very important. Next, you provide the program assurances that I had just talked about, and those are, having a non-punitive, confidential, and voluntary system. And that can be part of what's called the Memorandum of Understanding, which is a written and legally binding understanding between the different stakeholder parties. And we included the ATSAP Memorandum of Understanding in an appendix of the report. It's really excellent MOU. The next is to establish the formal reporting process. That can be something simple, and I'll talk about the scalability of a reporting system in just a moment, or it can be something like what I'm going to propose in just a moment in the next slide. The next step is to identify and train the report review team members. And the literature will refer to these team members with different terminology. Some people call them incident review members, event review committees. But basically, it's a small committee composed mostly of 3 individuals, labor, management, and regulator representation. And also part of that program is, or part of the committee is, a neutral program liaison. And the program liaison can be that person who can get back in touch with the reporter to clarify information. The next step is to define the review process. What is it that these folks are going to go through? Are they going to adopt something like a root cause analysis to determine what the reasons for the incident were? So that has to be spelled out. Next is disseminating the system information to the bigger audience, management, how does it get back to the employees and so forth. And then one of the last things to consider that before you implement a reporting system is that you just shouldn't start cold with this. You have to pilot the system. And with all of the systems that we reviewed, they learned invaluable lessons from the pilot demonstration. At the largest scale of a safety reporting system, what we have recommended is the process that I'm going to go through here now. And it starts with the report submittal from the individual who experienced the incident. The initial report is reviewed and coded by that person who could be the liaison or some designated analyst. Then the point where any information that needs to be clarified could happen. We talk about report de-identification here before it gets submitted to the review team, because the review team, in a small transit agency could know the individual who reported it. And then the next step is for the review team to meet and discuss corrective actions. So in the systems that we reviewed, they would wait until they had a significant number of reports before they would convene. For a small transit agency, you might meet quarterly, you might meet twice a year. And then finally, the liaison, who's the neutral party, conveys the findings to management and the employee. And then probably one of the most important things to not forget about this is that the success of the corrective actions need to be monitored so that you have a sense of whether or not they were successful. So that last step is definitely something not to be overlooked. And so I had mentioned earlier that perhaps a small agency couldn't handle the size of a type of reporting system that I just described. Any agency can start small with something as simple as a suggestion and comments box. Ideally, you would implement those key features that I talked about, but some agencies that we've talked to, even since the report, are not necessarily comfortable having something completely confidential, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't implement something. Just implementing something like this could greatly improve your safety culture. And a final thought, and one of my favorite quotes when we were doing the literature review is by Reinhardt. And basically the quote is, "An accident is one incident too many." And this really points to the fact that if you can understand why all these incidents are occurring before they turn into something catastrophic, you can prevent the next big accident. And a safety reporting system is one way to allow agencies to determine the causes of these events.
As I went back and prepared for this webinar, I went back and reread our report, which now it's been close to 2 years since we wrote it. And I thought, gee, if I had to pick out a couple of key messages, I have 3 things that I think stand out to me and Amanda. First, a rules compliance program involves more than just some operational testing. Second, you cannot successfully correct rule noncompliance unless you understand the underlying reason or reasons for the noncompliance. And then finally, it's really important to evaluate the effectiveness of your rules compliance practices, because if you don't evaluate them, you won't know whether or not they're working. Those are our 3 takeaway messages from all of this.